The roar of B-25 bombers over Tokyo at midday on April 18, 1942, drastically shifted the trajectory of the Pacific War, pushing Japan into a defensive stance that would eventually hasten its defeat. Admiral Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, was said to be deeply shaken by the raid. His chief of staff, Admiral Ugaki, recorded in his diary, "Today the victory belonged to the enemy." This was the first foreign assault on Japanese soil in more than 600 years. Though physically limited, 50 dead, 252 wounded, and 90 buildings damaged, it shattered the illusion of homeland, invulnerability, and drove Japan into strategic miscalculations that proved disastrous at Midway only 7 weeks later. The psychological shock was so severe that Tokyo's air defense commander committed ritual suicide out of shame. The raid reverberated across the nation like a chill. Captain Kurushima, Yamamoto's operations officer, later recounted how 16 specially modified B-25 Mitchell bombers, each armed with 4 500-pound bombs and led by Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, took off from the USS Hornet, 650 nautical miles from Japan, 250 miles farther than intended, after being spotted at 7:38 a.m. by the Japanese picket boat Nido Maru. What followed highlighted American ingenuity, exposed Japanese vulnerabilities, and set in motion the chain of events that culminated in Japan's first major naval defeat at Midway. Pre-war Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine had ruled out such an attack. Carrier-launched bomber strikes were considered technically impossible. Japanese strategists calculated that carrier-based planes could operate only within 250 nautical miles, limited by the need to return to their ships. Defensive perimeters were built on this assumption. The idea of launching medium bombers from carriers defied every principle of naval aviation as they understood it. Their reasoning seemed sound. The B-25 Mitchell, with a 67-foot wingspan, dwarfed typical carrier planes, like the F-4F, Wildcat 27 feet, or the SBD, Dauntless 42 feet. At a loaded weight of 29,000 pounds, it was nearly 3 times heavier than standard carrier aircraft. Japanese analysts correctly noted that such a plane would normally require over 800 feet of runway, far longer than any carrier deck. Yet this belief proved catastrophically wrong. At Eglin Field, Florida, American engineers redesigned the B-25s for the mission. They added 265-gallon steel fuel tanks in the bomb bays, rubber bladder tanks, and 10 5-gallon jerry cans for in-flight manual refueling, nearly doubling fuel capacity from 670 to 1,189 gallons. They reduced weight by removing the lower turret, radio gear and excess equipment, and even fitted fake wooden tail guns for deterrence. Lieutenant Henry Miller trained crews in revolutionary short-field takeoff methods, holding brakes with both feet, flaps set halfway, stabilizers pulled back 3/4, and building maximum manifold pressure before release. Doolittle's lead bomber lifted off in just 467 feet. Lieutenant Donald Smith managed it in only 287 feet. A 20-knot headwind over Hornet's deck, combined with the carrier's forward speed, gave the aircraft the extra lift needed, turning the impossible into reality. Japanese defenses were arranged around flawed assumptions. Early warning picket boats converted fishing vessels and were stationed in intervals based on previous U.S. raids against Wake and Marcus Islands, where carriers approached within 200 miles. But the Nido Maru, which spotted Task Force 16, was 650 miles out, well beyond their anticipated perimeter. More importantly, Japan in April 1942 had no radar network, relying solely on visual observation from these picket ships. The morning of April 18th began in Tokyo with a routine air raid drill. No alarm sounded. Wardens watched empty skies while fire brigades rolled equipment through the streets, simply following procedure. When the exercise ended uneventfully, Tokyo citizens went about their day, shopping, visiting shrines, strolling in parks, and attending baseball games. Then at noon, the reality struck. A French correspondent in Tokyo described, "I heard the harsh, powerful sound of aircraft engines. Tower raid at high noon. Explosions. I saw a dark plane streaking low over rooftops. So they've come." At first, civilians were bewildered. Some waved at the fast twin-engined planes, only later noticing the American stars on their wings. Shock set in when bombs fell and anti-aircraft fire erupted. The psychological effect far outweighed the physical destruction. Radio Tokyo had promised citizens that they, the nation, and Emperor Hirohito were beyond the enemy's reach, shielded by the kamikaze spirit, a mystical fortress unbroken since Kublai Khan's failed invasion of 1281. The 26th Air Flotilla, commanded by Rear Admiral Seigo Yamagata, held primary responsibility for homeland defense. Its Kisarazu Air Group, based in Chiba Prefecture, formed the first line of aerial protection. The unit scrambled 29 Mitsubishi G4M, Betty medium bombers armed with torpedoes, along with 24 carrier fighters fitted with long-range fuel tanks, all dispatched in search of U.S. carriers they assumed must be operating within 200 miles of Japan. Japanese fighter pilots soon faced a tactical scenario they had never encountered. The incoming B-25 bombers flew far lower than expected, skimming the waves before pulling up to just 2,500 feet to drop their bombs. Some of the very first Ki-61 liquid-cooled fighters ever deployed engaged them over Yokohama. These prototypes were so new that American crews mistook them for German Bf-109s. Perhaps most striking was the lack of aggression in Japanese interceptions. Many pilots failed to press home their attacks, while others misidentified the unfamiliar B-25 silhouettes as Japanese aircraft. The interception was a complete failure. Despite Japanese claims of shooting down 9 bombers, in reality, not a single one was destroyed. Naval officer Shigeyoshi Miwa later admitted bitterly that anti-aircraft gunners did no better. Though they judged altitude correctly, their bursts consistently missed left or right of the swift bombers. The fire was heavy but inaccurate, with only First Lieutenant Richard Joyce's B-25 suffering minor damage from flak. Admiral Yamamoto's reaction revealed both anguish and foresight. Just days before the raid, he had written to Niwa Michichi at her Tokyo geisha house. "What worries me slightly is that, although the war has lasted little more than 3 months, many people already feel at ease and even express gratitude to Admiral Yamamoto because not a single air raid has occurred. But the absence of the enemy so far owes nothing to Yamamoto, only to the enemy himself." After the raid, Yamamoto confessed deep distress. "I was grieved to hear that Tokyo finally suffered an air raid." Yet he added with pragmatism, perhaps it was just enough of a taste to shake the people of Tokyo from their complacency. His sharpest criticism targeted the military's failure. "It is a disgrace that the skies over the imperial capital were violated without a single enemy. Aircraft shot down. The raid gave Yamamoto the leverage he needed to push through his Midway operation." The Naval General Staff, led by Admiral Osami Nagano, had preferred isolating Australia by seizing Fiji, New Caledonia, and Samoa. They had dismissed Yamamoto's warnings about homeland vulnerability as unrealistic, until American bombers proved him right. Momentum accelerated rapidly. Humiliated by the raid, Japanese leaders rushed debate, and on May 5th, the Imperial General Headquarters issued Navy Order No. 18, authorizing the seizure of Midway and positions in the Aleutians. Japan's objectives were clear: prevent further raids, extend the defensive perimeter eastward, destroy what remained of the U.S. carrier fleet, and turn Midway into a forward base for homeland defense. Importantly, the diversionary Aleutian campaign required 2 carriers that otherwise might have strengthened Yamamoto's main force at Midway, a weakness with decisive consequences. Japanese military diaries reveal an institution struggling to comprehend an event they had believed impossible. Admiral Matome Ugaki, Yamamoto's chief of staff, wrote bluntly in his wartime journal, "Fading victory. Today the victory belonged to the enemy." Captain Kuroshima Kameo, Yamamoto's brilliant yet eccentric operations officer, described the raid as passing like a shiver over Japan, a phrase that captured both its fleeting physical presence and enduring psychological shock. Naval officers like Mitsuo Fuchida and Shigeyoshi Miwa, though bitterly disappointed, acknowledged professionally that from the American perspective, the raid was superb strategy. The gap between propaganda and reality was stark. While official announcements claimed thousands of civilian deaths, post-war records revealed the truth: 50 killed, 252 injured, and 90 buildings damaged or destroyed. The inflated claim of 9 downed bombers particularly infuriated officers like Miwa, who knew full well that none had been destroyed. Radio Tokyo's first broadcast came even before the Americans announced the raid. Enemy bombers appeared over Tokyo for the first time in the present war. Invading planes caused no damage to military facilities. Propagandists quickly tried to downplay the event, labeling it the do-nothing raid. Even Emperor Hirohito's role was notable. He personally commuted death sentences for 3 of the 8 captured raiders, took part in strategic discussions on retaliation, and ordered the army in China to completely destroy military installations, airfields, and vital communication lines in areas where the raiders had landed. The raid's origins traced back to Navy Captain Francis Lowe's observation at Naval Station, Norfolk on January 10, 1942. Observing Army bombers rehearsing over a runway painted to resemble a carrier deck, Captain Francis Lowe recognized that twin-engine bombers might actually be launched from carriers. Admiral Ernest King approved the idea, and General Hap Arnold chose Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a test pilot, aeronautical engineer with a Ph.D. from MIT and a master of calculated risk, to command the mission. At Eglin Field, Florida, Doolittle began the selection process with the 17th Bombardment Group, the unit with the most seasoned B-25 crews. When asked to volunteer for a dangerous secret assignment, all 140 men immediately stepped forward. From this pool, 24 5-man crews were chosen, later reduced to 16 for the actual raid. Training ran from February 27 to March 25, 1942, pushing both men and aircraft to their limits. Pilots drilled in short-field takeoffs on painted carrier outlines until they could consistently launch within 400 feet. Low-level flight over water navigation and precision bombing at minimum altitude became standard practice. The B-25s were heavily modified for the mission. Fuel capacity was doubled, weight was cut by removing non-essential gear, and each aircraft was adapted for long-range strikes. Every crew had 5 specialists: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, and engineer-gunner. Among them were notable figures such as Ted Lawson, whose memoir later became a bestseller, Robert Gray, killed in the CBI Theater in October 1942, and Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, who lived to be the last surviving raider, passing away in April 2019 at age 103. The launch on April 18th showcased remarkable U.S. naval air coordination, despite heavy seas washing over the USS Hornet's bow and early detection, forcing a launch 10 hours ahead of schedule and 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than intended. All 16 planes lifted off successfully between 8:20 and 9:19 a.m. Doolittle led from the front, taking off first with only 467 feet of deck to work with. 2 entire crews fell into Japanese hands, beginning an ordeal that revealed the harsh reality of Japanese prisoner treatment. Crew number 6, the Green Hornet, piloted by Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, ditched off the Chinese coast after fuel exhaustion, losing 2 men to drowning. Crew number 16, Bat Out of Hell, led by Lieutenant William Farrow, bailed out over Japanese-occupied territory near Nanchang. The 8 captured airmen, Hallmark, Robert Meter and Chase Nielsen from Crew 6, along with Farrow, Robert Height, George Barr, Harold Spatz, and Jacob DeShazer from Crew 6 were flown to Tokyo for interrogation by the Kempitai. Torture included the notorious water cure, forcing prisoners to drink as much as 5 gallons of liquid, mixed with kerosene and urine, until their stomachs grotesquely swelled, after which guards would beat or jump on them. To legally justify execution, the Japanese government issued the Enemy Airmen's Act on August 13, 1942, retroactively accusing the flyers of bombing civilians despite no evidence. At a sham trial on August 28 in Shanghai Police Headquarters, all 8 were sentenced to death. Emperor Hirohito later commuted 5 sentences to life imprisonment, but 3 men still faced execution. On October 15, 1942, at 4:30 p.m., Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, 28, Lieutenant William Farrow, 24, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, 21, were taken to Shanghai's Public Cemetery No. 1 and shot by firing squad. Lieutenant Robert Meter died on December 1, 1943, from malnutrition, dysentery, and beriberi after 20 months in captivity. The 4 remaining survivors, Chase Nielsen, Robert Height, George Barr, and Jacob DeShazer, endured 40 months in captivity, including 34 months in solitary confinement, before being freed by American paratroopers on August 20, 1945. Japan's vengeance against Chinese civilians who aided the raiders became one of the Pacific War's worst atrocities. Operation Seigo, also known as the Zhejiang Jiangxi Campaign, began on May 15, 1942, only 27 days after the raid, and lasted until September 4th, devastating some 20,000 square miles of territory. General Shunroku, Hata's China Expeditionary Army unleashed enormous forces, 40 infantry battalions and 15-16 artillery battalions, around 180,000 men, under Lieutenant General Shigeru Sawada's 13th Army and Lieutenant General Isamu, Yokoyama's 11th Army. Most horrifyingly, Unit 731 under General Shiro Ishii dispatched 150 troops armed with biological agents including cholera, typhoid, plague, dysentery, anthrax, and paratyphoid. The toll was staggering. Japanese forces executed roughly 250,000 Chinese civilians suspected of helping American airmen. Chinese military losses included 724 officers and 23,637 soldiers killed, with thousands more wounded or missing. The biological warfare effort backfired as well. Over 10,000 Japanese soldiers became infected with their own pathogens, and 1,700 died, mainly from cholera. The systematic destruction campaign aimed to eliminate any chance of future American raids from Chinese bases. Japanese forces mounted 1,131 airstrikes against Chuchao Airfield alone, Doolittle's intended destination. Every airfield capable of accommodating B-25 bombers was rendered permanently unusable. The Doolittle Raid's strategic consequences reshaped the Pacific War through a chain reaction of events that ultimately contributed to Japan's downfall, its immediate impact forcing Japan to recall 4 Army fighter groups for home defense in 1942-43 when they were urgently needed in the South Pacific, was only the beginning of the resource misallocation that crippled Japan for the rest of the war. The raid also hastened the Battle of Midway by dissolving resistance within the Naval General Staff and securing Army support for Yamamoto's plan. This decision set Japan on the path toward its first major naval defeat. The diversion of 2 carriers to the Aleutian operation intended to guard against future bomber bases significantly weakened the Midway strike force. At the decisive moment, when 4 Japanese fleet carriers were lost on June 4 to 5, 1942, Japan not only lost capital ships but also invaluable air crews, along with the strategic initiative. Psychological effects were equally profound. The raid created what American planners later called a fear complex, compelling Japan to squander resources on defensive measures for the rest of the war. The shift from offense to defense drove Japan to expand its perimeter beyond sustainable limits, leaving supply lines vulnerable to American submarines. The raid's long-term influence on Japanese military doctrine was wide-reaching. Homeland defense became a top priority, siphoning resources from other theaters and contributing to losses in the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Central Pacific. The collapse of offensive momentum after Midway, partly driven by the raid's psychological shock, allowed the U.S. to seize and maintain the initiative with its island-hopping campaign. Historians still debate whether Midway would have happened without the Doolittle Raid. Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully argue in Shattered Sword that Midway planning predated April 18th, though they acknowledge the raid as the catalyst that overcame internal opposition and accelerated the timeline. Mark Stilla highlights the raid's creation of an inefficient force disposition that persisted throughout the war. Among the captured raiders, Jacob DeShazer's story stands out as a remarkable testament to resilience and transformation. The bombardier from Crew 16 survived 40 months in Japanese captivity, enduring torture, starvation, and 34 months of solitary confinement. In 1944, he was given a Bible for just 3 weeks, an experience that completely reshaped his outlook. After liberation, DeShazer made a life-altering choice to return to Japan as a missionary. In 1948, only 3 years after his release, he arrived in Nagoya, one of the very cities he had bombed, beginning 3 decades of missionary work. His tract, I Was a Prisoner of Japan, reached millions with its message of forgiveness. The most extraordinary result of his testimony came when Mitsuo Fuchida, the commander who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, read DeShazer's account. Struggling with defeat and searching for meaning, Fuchida was profoundly moved, leading to his conversion. The two former enemies became close friends and fellow missionaries, a living symbol of reconciliation. Other surviving raiders took different paths. Chase Nielsen remained in the Air Force, retiring after a full career. Robert Hite pursued civilian work while serving in the Air Force Reserve until his death in 2015. The last surviving POW of the raid, George Barr, left permanently debilitated by his treatment, was medically retired and battled psychological trauma until his death in 1967. The Doolittle Raid achieved strategic results far beyond what its planners had anticipated. Though it inflicted little physical destruction, it shattered Japan's sense of invulnerability, accelerated missteps that culminated at Midway, provoked devastating retaliation against China, and forced Japan into inefficient resource distribution for the remainder of the conflict. For the 80 volunteers, however, the price was heavy. 3 died during the raid or escape. 3 were executed, 1 perished in captivity, and 10 more were later lost in combat. Their sacrifice altered the course of the war. The technical feat itself, Army medium bombers launched from a Navy carrier, showcased American ingenuity and inter-service cooperation that became hallmarks of the Pacific War. The success of the B-25 carrier launch upended Japanese assumptions about American limitations, contributing to a recurring pattern of underestimation that proved disastrous. Japanese leaders recognized the raid's significance immediately. Yamamoto was deeply shaken. Tokyo's air defense commander committed suicide, and internal reports acknowledged that the nation's most fundamental assumptions had been overturned. The long-standing myth of homeland invulnerability, sustained since the divine wind repelled the Mongols in 1281, was destroyed. In those moments over Tokyo, for the United States, the raid delivered badly needed proof that Japan was not beyond reach. After months of setbacks and retreats across the Pacific, the sight of American bombers over Tokyo electrified the nation and revived public morale. The operation validated the bold risk-taking that would come to define U.S. strategy in the Pacific. The human element gave the mission its enduring depth, 80 volunteers accepting near certain danger, Chinese civilians sacrificing their lives to protect downed airmen, Japanese civilians experiencing the war firsthand only months after, celebrating its early victories. Military history became human drama. Ted Lawson losing a leg and later telling his story in a best-selling memoir. Jacob DeShazer returning as a missionary to the very city he had bombed. Richard Cole living to 103, the final surviving raider and witness to the mission. These personal accounts give weight and meaning to what might otherwise seem only strategic calculations. The Doolittle Raid remains a masterstroke of psychological warfare, achieving, through audacity, what conventional power could not. By shattering Japanese assumptions about carrier aviation limits, exposing the homeland's vulnerability, and provoking disproportionate retaliation, 16 B-25 bombers reshaped the Pacific War more decisively than some fleet battles. Its true success lay not in physical destruction, but in altering perceptions. Admiral Yamamoto's earlier warning that America's absence from Japanese skies was due not to Japan's strength but to enemy choice proved prophetic. The Naval General Staff's dismissal of long-range carrier strikes as unrealistic gave way to frantic overreaction. Each strategic misstep in the aftermath traced back to those brief but fateful minutes over Tokyo. Modern strategists continue to study the Doolittle Raid as a case study in asymmetric warfare, demonstrating how limited means can generate outsized strategic consequences through psychological effect. The investment, 80 men, 16 modified bombers, 2 carriers, yielded returns that shaped the course of the entire Pacific War. But the human cost cannot be ignored. The mass execution of Chinese civilians in reprisal remains one of the war's most disproportionate atrocities. The captured raiders' torture and executions stand as enduring evidence of the cruelty masked by strategic headlines. These acts of inhumanity remain inseparable from the raid's legacy. Yet even from such darkness emerged hope. DeShazer's return to Japan as a missionary, and Fuchida's conversion after reading his account, turned former enemies into allies in faith. Their friendship embodied reconciliation after devastation, proving that even the worst horrors of war can give rise to forgiveness. The 16 B-25s that thundered off the USS Hornet on the gray morning of April 18, 1942, carried more than bombs. They carried proof that ingenuity could defy the impossible, that boldness could overturn certainty, and that 80 determined men could alter history in a single daring flight over Tokyo.